All right, well, let's carry on here with culture and chat a little bit about culture and emotion because the two of them go hand in hand. Maybe you're going to say to yourself, well, John, I'm not quite sure that's the case, but hey, let's chat about it and see if I'm right. So, in the 1950s and 1960s, social scientists tended to fall into one of two camps. So, there's the universalist camp, and they said that emotions evolved as a response to our environments, of our ancestors. They're the same across all cultures. So things are talked about as automatic, natural, physiological, and instinctual. But then we also had this other camp, and it was the social constructivist camp, and they said that humans had evolved to adapt to their distinctive cultural environments, and thus emotions are culturally variable. Now, to also give you just the larger context, so it wasn't just emotions that were being talked about, it was the entire human experience. And a lot of this began out of discussion about language. Is language a universal thing, or is it a constructivist thing? Is it something that we've come up with? So, this is kind of the background. Now, here's some of the interesting things. So, this debate kind of went on, and as I've talked about in chapter 11, there were some folks who did some research. So Ekman and colleagues in 1978, and they developed the facial action coding system. And what they found was that there are specific facial muscle configurations that are associated with specific emotions. Then they took photos of people posing with these different expressions, right? And then what they did is they showed these pictures to people from different cultures and asked them to match them with emotion words. And across all the cultures, participants recognize these emotional facial expressions. And so, thus came the argument that there's these universally recognized emotions. However, and this is kind of the other part of the story, they also found considerable variability across cultures in recognition rates. So, what they ended up finding out that there's something that's called display rules about which emotions are appropriate to show in a given situation. Now, research shows that emotions are multifaceted. There's cultural similarities as well as differences that exist for each facet. So, thus, rather than classifying emotions as either universal or socially constructed, we're now trying to identify the specific similarities and differences of emotional life across cultures. And so, one of the more helpful things has been this idea of display rules, which rules dictate how and when and why we show emotion. Now, two cultural contexts have received probably the most empirical attention by social scientists, and this is for many reasons, but one of them just being familiarity and cross-cultural transmissions across kind of two large groupings. We talk about North America, so United States and Canada, and then East Asia, so China, Japan, and Korea. Now, we talked in the previous video about certain places being much more individualistic. So, for example, North American contexts tend to be highly individualistic, so prioritizing personal over group needs. However, in these East Asian contexts, there's a strong emphasis on collectivism, so prioritizing the group over one's personal needs. So, what we found in different studies is that these differences in individualism and collectivism actually translate into different models of the self. So, we talked about self construal in the last video as well. In North American context, that dominant model of the self is an independent one, whereas in East Asian contexts, the model of the self is an interdependent one. So the classic study that kind of looked at this, U.S. participants were more likely than Japanese participants to complete the stem "I am blank" with psychological attributes. So they would say like, "I am friendly," "I am cheerful," whereas Japanese participants were much more likely to complete the stem with references to the social roles and the responsibilities that they had. So, for example, "I am a daughter" or "I am a student." These different models of the self result in different principles for how we interact with other people. So, even though we express or respond similarly on a physiological level to different emotions, there are differences and in terms of facial expressions. So, for example, European Canadians smile more. Americans, smile more frequently and more intensely during positive emotional events than Hmong counterparts. So these differences support the idea that there are display rules and models of self. So in North American context, in the independent self, we express our emotions to influence others. Whereas in East Asian contexts, with the interdependent self, there is greater control and suppression of emotions in order to adjust to others. Now, so people across all cultures suppress their emotions, but culture influences the consequences of suppression on well being. So, for example, in North American contexts, we believe that suppressing emotions can have a negative consequence for well being, whereas in Asian contexts, emotional suppression is part of normal life, it's not associated with depression and decreased life satisfaction. So, it's interesting to note that these display rules actually have mental health consequences as well, and that those consequences can be different based on what is considered normal or okay within our culture. We find too that people across cultures feel good during positive events, but culture influences whether people feel bad during positive events. So, for an example, in North American contexts, people rarely feel bad after good experiences. However, in East Asian contexts, people are more likely to feel bad and good, to have mixed emotions during positive events. One theory has been that this is because East Asians are more likely to engage in dialectical thinking. So, dialectical thinking is like having this dialogue that recognizes that no experience uh, is innately fully good or fully bad, but there's always this give and take. So, for example, graduation. Yeah, that's a positive thing. Woohoo, great job. You got your degree. You're going to go on with life. But at the same time, you're also leaving school. You're leaving relationships that you formed over the last, however many years. You're leaving familiarity for the unknown. And so it is actually, it's good to have that dialectic between what this positive event means. And so the theory has been that because that type of thinking is much more common in East Asian cultures, that is likely why there's the experience of both positive and negative emotions when there is an experience such as that. So people across all cultures want to feel good, but culture also influences people's ideal affect or the specific types of affective states. So when we talk about an affective state, it's the type of emotional arousal the one feels that's coupled with intensity as well. And so this can range from pleasant to unpleasant, high arousal or low arousal. In North America in general, we tend to lean towards feeling excited, enthusiastic, energetic, and either kind of high arousal, positive states. So these are kind of the valued things that we want people to be. Whereas people in East Asian contexts prefer feeling calm, they prefer uh, low arousal, positive states such as calm, peaceful, and so forth. Now, these cultural differences in ideal affect can then result in different emotional lives. So, for example, people in North American contexts tend to prefer more thrilling activities such as skydiving or, I don't know, axe throwing or those types of things. Whereas people from East Asian contexts prefer tranquil activities, relaxing, being out in nature, seeing beautiful things. And so you can see this down here on the old Facebook as well, just that can actually come out. And the types of pictures and the things and the way that we project who we are as a person and the types of things that we value. People also base their well being and their happiness on their ideal affect. So, European Americans are more likely to define well being in terms of excitement. And we ask that a lot. Hey, are you excited? How you doing? You excited? You ready for Christmas? We focus on that a lot. Whereas Chinese people, for example, are more likely to define well-being in terms of calmness. People across cultures base their happiness on similar types of factors, but culture again places the weight that or influences the weight that we place on each factor. So, for example, both European Americans and Chinese subjects both wanted life satisfaction, self esteem, and their relationships. Those were really important, but their weighting was very different. So, for example, European Americans based their life satisfaction primarily on self esteem, whereas Chinese people based their life satisfaction equally on self esteem and relationship harmony. So all of these studies kind of point to us that, in general, people in individualistic cultures, they tend to evaluate satisfaction according to how they feel emotionally. So if we feel get well, everything is going well. Whereas in collectivistic cultures, people's life satisfaction tends to be based on a balance between emotions and norms, the things that are important and within that culture. So you might be saying to yourself, well, John, this is terrific. Why does this even matter? Why are we learning about this? Why have the textbook authors decided to subject me to this, other than the fact that it's interesting? Well, here's the thing. Because of globalization, and because of the fact that we now live in a world where we are more interconnected than ever before, understanding different cultures and understanding how emotion and culture go together is critical, first of all, for preventing miscommunications across cultures. Secondly, it also helps us to have insights into other paths of psychological health and well being. I mean, just because something is normal within our culture, is it actually healthy? If we assume that everything that we do in our culture is normal and healthy, well, that's a type of ethnocentric bias, isn't it? So it's important for us to see all the good that's out there and to maybe pull from some of those traditions when we need to. Now, what about other cultures? This is a good question because, to be very honest with you, a lot of cross cultural studies have not been as cross cultural as what we've wanted. Now, we do know that there are differences across other cultures, such as between specific Western contexts. But since people are being raised in increasingly multiple cultural contexts, more research really is needed to understand how we negotiate and integrate these different cultures in our emotional lives. This is a huge area that needs people that study it. Now, if we're talking about the fact that there are these emotional differences, well, there has to be a way then that these differences are transmitted across cultures. So, how are they transmitted? So, cultural ideas, as we've kind of said before, they're reflected in and reinforced by practices, institutions, and products, rituals, all of those things. And one way that we can see this difference is, for example, in children's storybooks. So, for example, best selling children's storybooks in the US often contain very exciting and less calm content than do the best selling children's storybooks in Taiwan. Across cultures, kids who are read stories with exciting content are probably more likely to value excited states, whereas kids who read calm stories are more likely to value these calm states. So, thus, regardless of ethnic background, direct exposure to storybook content can affect children's ideal affect. So, perhaps one of the things that we can do if we're wanting to shift things is to actually look at some of those early practices. It's important to note, too, that we could argue that perhaps these differences are due to temperament. However, there's a couple important things to note. First of all, temperament is a biological factor, and we do know that even across cultures, people have different temperaments. So to say that it's just at the cultural level, two cultures with different temperaments, I don't think is a fair statement of the fact. We also know that these things, culture and temperament play roles in our emotional lives. And so, for example, one theory, affect valuation theory, proposes that some of these cultural factors shape how people want to feel more than how they actually feel. So that we tend to focus more on the ideal affect versus our actual affect. And so, I mean, that is perhaps a good starting point of looking at these things. This is going to wrap up, though, our big thoughts for culture at this point in time. Looking forward to hearing your thoughts this week in the discussion posts. Keep those questions coming, and we'll talk soon.